right, guys, welcome back to Revive School. Here we are. It's a brand new lesson, brand new book of the Bible. Kevin, that's kind of exciting. I mean, we just finished up Jeremiah. We wrapped up Isaiah not too long ago, honestly. And here we are continuing on with the major prophets. Now, Lamentations is not a prophet. It's a prophet lamenting over the city of Jerusalem. I mean, this is the reality of all of the destruction that has happened to his people. And so you have one long book. It's really not that long, but it feels like it. You got 5 laments, 5 chapters, and it's just kind of like, man, Lord, I know I haven't ever taught on this before. Because it's not that exciting. Look, I have no problem saying that, and yet the reality is this little book, when you spend time digging into it, can honestly help you find hope amidst it all. Part of the Revive School's purpose is to point out where do you see the Messiah in every single book of the Bible. And Lamentations is no different. And Lamentations, to me, as you're lamenting, you still have to find hope. You still have to look for, the light at the end of the tunnel. And so when you look at Lamentations 3:22, and it really goes into verse 24, listen to this description. It says, "Because of the Lord's faithful love, we do not perish, for his mercies never end." Okay, so think about that just for a second, Kevin, back in 22. You probably feel like your life is over in those moments. I'm serious. Like, I don't know how I'm going to pay for this. I don't know about how I'm going to deal with my family who's dealing, with this illness. My relationship is hard. School is tough. Whatever the context is, like, it really feels overwhelming. It feels, there's a huge burden. You can just see it on people. You can feel it on yourself. But remember, God's faithful love, man, he's constantly there. And so it's like this drip, and I know Mindy has an awesome description of this, but it's like God's just pouring out his mercy. He's pouring out his love, and it never stops. And then in verse 23, he says these mercies, they're new every morning. So when you wake up, no matter how hard your life is, no matter how bad the situation is, God just keeps pouring out his mercies. It's unbelievable, isn't it? Because your mercies are new. It's like, great is your faithfulness. And so here's the phrase that we want us to have in verse 24. "I say, the Lord is my portion. Therefore, I will put my hope in him." So here's the deal. When you are in a season of lamenting, and it's okay. Lamenting is not a bad thing. Lamenting, crying out to the Lord, is not a sign of weakness. You know what it really is? It's you saying, God, I can't do this. I need you. And so when I see this phrase, my portion, okay, I understand it's not capitalized. I understand, it kind of throws it off a little bit. But really, my portion is how you get through these dark times. And what you're going to hear is all throughout the book of Lamentations, us looking for, how is the writer looking for hope? How is the writer looking for his portion in all this process? And so when you look at the title, Lamentations, it conveys this title, and John MacArthur does a great job for backdrop of the book for me. It conveys the idea of loud cries. That's what you're talking about, these loud cries, and it's derived from the translation that actually comes from the Latin Vulgate and the Septuagint. And so no other entire book really consists of just laments. You can't really just find a book that's this depressing. As does this distasteful dirge. I mean, I don't know how else to describe this. Like, I have no problem saying what he's going to describe, you guys, is legit. What he's describing is like there really isn't anything that exciting. So it's a follow-up to what Isaiah prophesied about the Babylonian captivity, the fall of Jerusalem. But it's really about the heart of Jeremiah possibly, which we'll get into. And so this book, what this book does, and I love what John MacArthur says, this book actually keeps the memory alive of the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC. That's really what this is. Do you remember how bad it was? I want to make sure you remember that. And so that's kind of really what we're looking at. And so that's kind of your title now. The author-wise, it doesn't ever say that this book was written by Jeremiah. Okay, but you can imply, based on the internal and historical indicators that this was Jeremiah. There's a lot of things that Jeremiah would have seen, and it really makes sense that it could have been Jeremiah. So go to Jeremiah 7:29. There's at least couple illustrations. Maybe, again, Jeremiah 7:29. By no means am I saying it's 100%, but kind of look at this mentality. Jeremiah 7:29, okay? So God told Jeremiah, like, there needs to be a time of lament. "Cut off the hair of your sacred vow and then throw it away. Raise up a dirge on the barren heights, for the Lord has rejected and abandoned the generation under his wrath." So there's this mentality of a lament, okay? Not saying there is, I'm just saying there's this mentality of of lament. In fact, can you go to 2 Chronicles 35:25? 2 Chronicles 35:25. Okay? And again, by no means, but look, Jeremiah then, remember when Josiah died? And Jeremiah chanted a dirge over Josiah? Basically, he was lamenting, he's writing on behalf of the life of Josiah. And so there is this, and all the singing men and singing women still speak of Josiah and their dirges to this very day. There was something about whatever Jeremiah wrote, there was a form of lament in this. So it obviously is going to come natural for Jeremiah. So again, did he officially write it? We don't know. But I think what you'll see based on what we're describing, because you guys, here's the reality. This whole thing is a lament over Jerusalem. Okay? So if that's the case, we know that Jeremiah very clearly was predicting what? If you can go to that timeline for me, Tom, the kings and the prophets. During or soon after, I mean what? Jeremiah would have experienced the prophecy of the Babylonian captivity, and he would have experienced what? The captivity actually taking place, and the fall.
Total destruction.
The total destruction of Jerusalem. So if there's anybody that has an eyewitness account, it's going to be Jeremiah. So to me, this makes sense. I mean, think about this. John MacArthur says it was mid-July when the city of Jerusalem fell. Mid-August when the temple was burned. Okay, likely, we can't even say this enough, but there's a really good chance he saw the destruction of the walls, the towers, the homes, the palace, and the temple. We're going to get into that more and more today. And he would have wrote while the whole event remained painfully fresh in his memory. So, and this would have been taking place before his departure into Egypt in 583 BC in Jeremiah 43. So he would have seen this. There's a really good chance he would have witnessed this. And so if you do want to do a comparison, it's kind of interesting. Can you go to Jeremiah 30, verse 14 for me? I'm just going to do just a little bit of a comparison of the lament, of a prophetic lament. Jeremiah 30, verse 14, okay? Here's a picture, Kevin, if you would. Jeremiah 30, verse 14 says, "All your lovers have forgotten you. They no longer look for you, for I have struck you as your enemy would, with the discipline of someone cruel because of your enormous guilt and your innumerable sins." Okay? This is a language. Okay? Now, if you go to Lamentations, Kevin, 1:2. Okay? Here you have the same language. Lamentations 1:2. "She weeps aloud during the night with tears on her cheeks. There is no one to offer her comfort, not one from all of her lovers. All of her friends have betrayed her. They have become her enemies." And so there's this similar language that you can do a comparison from Jeremiah to Lamentations. Lamentations to Jeremiah. And I have at least 5 references here just from Jeremiah and Lamentations that you could walk through the comparison. We're not going to do that, but just to give you an idea. All right, a couple other things, background and setting. Now, if you're new to Revive School, we always take a lot longer on the book, introducing the book, because honestly, I just think, and this is kind of what's refreshing for me with Revive School, is we're getting to know more of the backdrop, which really paints a bigger picture of the whole thing. And so you're not just reading Lamentations 3, 22, 23, and 24 because you know that's supposed to be a magnet verse. You're like, why is he actually writing this? Well, a couple things. If you go to Joshua 23, 15 through 16. Joshua, not Jeremiah, Joshua 23, 15 through 16. Watch this. "Since every good thing the Lord your God has promised you has come about, so he will bring on you every bad thing until he has annihilated you from this good land the Lord your God has given you." Verse 16. "If you break the covenant of your Lord your God, which he commanded you, and go and worship other gods, and bow down to them, the Lord's anger will burn against you, and you will quickly disappear from this good land he has given you." So what you have, even in Joshua's time, is these prophetic pictures, right? That if you do this, Kevin, what will happen?
Good things.
And if you do good things, good things will happen. If you do bad things will happen. So there's this language, this mentality with his own people. Look, man, I'm making a covenant deal with you guys, but you got to kind of live up to your own deal. And so Joshua kind of has this language, okay? That was 800 years earlier. Now, here you have Jeremiah. We know this. He's the guy that's been walking around for 40 years, okay? He's clothed, not Isaiah. And Jeremiah prophesies, judgment is coming to your people. And that's exactly what he's saying. He's saying, judgment is coming to your people. My people, it's coming. And so here you have this picture that when judgment actually comes, it's going to come through, as we talked about this over and over again, judgment's going to come through King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian army. Also, the Chaldean people are going to be coming in. And so what does Jeremiah do when the prophetic word comes to fruition? He weeps, he's sorrowful, and he laments. Just because he released the prophetic word doesn't mean he likes it. It doesn't mean he wants this to happen to Jerusalem. It doesn't mean he wants this to happen to his own people. And so what you constantly are seeing is that this Lamentations, it so parallels with Jeremiah. Why? Because Jerusalem is being judged for their unrepentant sins.
How many times did Jeremiah warn them? They didn't listen to him. And then it's even greater what he has to say. He didn't want to do that, but he lives into it.
He lives into it, he walks into it, and now he writes about it.
Yeah.
At least 4 times you have in Scripture, at least 4 times. Tom, you alluded to this yesterday. Jeremiah 52 talks about the destruction and the downfall of Jerusalem. So you have that in Jerusalem 52. You have that in 2 Kings 25. You've got that in Jeremiah 39. You've got it in Jeremiah 52, and you got it in 2 Chronicles 36. 4 times you see descriptions and pictures of the downfall of Jerusalem. And the crazy thing is, you guys, is we still haven't seen Jerusalem being fully restored yet. Even in our lifetime, we still haven't seen it yet. People are arguing over a president moving an embassy to the city, saying this is the city that God has chosen, and people are still arguing over that. It's crazy how all of this stuff is just like, it's a big deal. And so here you have, just to kind of conclude kind of our wrap-up, I should say, when you're doing a background and a backdrop of a Lamentations, there's 154 verses. And as weird as these 5 chapters, and I'm not belittling the Word of God when I say that, but as weird as this lamenting is, and you're like, I'm not going to just pick this up and go charge for the day. Oh yeah, how should I get motivated for today? I'm not picking up Lamentations 1, okay? Sometimes I am. I'm picking up Lamentations 3 because I got to hold on to it because he's my portion. But the reality is 154 verses, and the Jews believe that this is the sacred canon. Like they never really have ever questioned this. In fact, Ruth, Esther, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, and Lamentations. Okay, we've actually referenced this in Revive School. There are 5 Old Testament books. Forgive me if I'm going to mispronounce this, but Megilloth, Megilloth. They're the 5 scrolls, and they're read in the synagogues on special occasions. So specifically, Ruth, Esther, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, and Lamentations. They're not that long. Now, Lamentations is read on the 9th of Ab, A-B, in July or August, which I think is really cool. Why? It's read to remember Jerusalem's destruction by Nebuchadnezzar. They don't want people to forget. They don't want people to forget. Why is it important? Let's just go there. Why is it important that they don't forget about the destruction of Jerusalem? Kevin, what would you say? Why is it so important? Who cares?
Because it's God's chosen city.
So it's God's chosen city, but what's our learning? What's our lesson about why God did this? Tom, what would you say?
Don't forget, when you break the covenant, God will keep his word, and it will break your heart.
Yep. So destruction came because of sin. So God brought about his judgment. So if I'm a people, I'm the Jewish people, and I'm opening this up and I'm reading this every year, I'm like, man, let's not be those people, because what's God going to do? So this is the reality of what they're after. And so, interesting enough, it's the same date that marked the destruction of Herod's temple by the Romans in AD 70. Kind of an interesting perspective on what is taking place. So a couple things. Again, the chief focus in all of Lamentations is God's judgment in response to Judah's sin. That's what this is. This is God's judgment in response to Judah's sin. And you have over multiple themes. You have, John MacArthur says, one of the themes is you have hope found in God's compassion, God's sovereign judgment. You have sweeping judgment that came across and yet to end every hope for Israel's salvation. Like it looked like it was horrible. It looked like there was no hope in any of this. And then here you have one of the major themes is Jeremiah's tears. When you think of the book of Lamentations, Jeremiah's tears, we're going to get to that, you guys, in Lamentations 3. I don't want to cover it today, but I will have no problem just telling you this. Like it is in full-on foreshadow of Christ weeping over Jerusalem as well. And so if there's anything of a takeaway, here you have a prophet who's weeping over the city that God had plans for, and Jesus does as well. And so I don't want to miss that. We didn't want to call Jesus, we didn't want to call the weeping prophet in this. It could be totally called that, but we didn't have a specific reference of how that would allude to. So just know that we're okay if you want to say those type of things. It's clearly Jeremiah weeps over his people just like Jesus does as well. And I will tell you this whole book, 5 chapters. Okay, 5 chapters, 5 laments. Kevin, here's what I love about this. Okay, with the exception of one, it's divided into 22 separate sections. Rich, being our in-house scholar, why 22 sections?
That would be one for each letter of the Jewish alphabet.
That's right. So here you have 5 of these laments. Today we're supposed to cover 2. Okay, we're going to really cover 1. Okay, it's talking about the suffering for sin. Talking about the sorrow of sin. That's what we're going to talk about. Lamentations 2 talks about the days that are no more. Okay, so that's about your Lamentations 2 right there. So let's jump into Lamentations 1 if we can, Kevin. And really the first 11 verses, I know I just said that it wasn't personal, it was more communal, but I will tell you the very first 11 verses is the exception. Okay, the first 11 verses really talk about Jeremiah's sorrow if you adhere to the fact that it would be Jeremiah. Okay, so Jeremiah's sorrow is going to be in the first 11 verses. So it says this, how she sits alone. The city once crowded with people. She who was great among the nations has become like a widow. The princess among the provinces has become a slave. So clearly, Kevin, he's talking about what city?
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem. And he compares Jerusalem, you guys, to a widow. Jerusalem is this desolate widow where she didn't have anybody. He also describes Jerusalem as a princess, and now it's like a slave. It's not really a great picture of Jerusalem being lonely, Jerusalem being literally, their people are mourning, and she's alone. The temple's gone. Multitudes of sins are there. So in verse 2, Jerusalem, she weeps aloud during the night. With tears on her cheeks, there's no one to offer her comfort. In other words, late at night when you go through a hard time, you look around, you're looking around, and you're like, hey, who can help me? Nobody. And so as they're looking around, not only her lovers aren't there, her friends aren't there, and in fact, the lovers and her friends, the ones that she wants to find comfort, Scripture says they become her enemies. Those that she thinks she can trust. So who would be some of these people? Well, the lovers or the friends, they could have been, you guys, the pagan nations that Judah allied themselves with, and guess what? They're not around. And it's a picture, it's a thought, but here's the point in verse 3, Judah has gone into exile. Kevin, that word exile, it's kind of floated around loosely. Where did Judah go?
They went off to Babylon.
They went off into Babylon, following affliction and harsh slavery. She lives among the nations, but finds no place to rest. You know what's interesting about that? Is that when you're in bondage, when you're in slavery, do you know how restless you are? Like, I keep going back to this image of nighttime. I feel like for me, when people are really wrestling and struggling, they don't get any sleep. I think about my kids going through school. You know what happens? They come into my room, I can't sleep. They come into my room, I can't sleep. Why? Because they're always thinking about something, but they're trying to find comfort. They're trying to find comfort, but they can't find it. Hopefully, yes, with us they can, but the context of Judah is there's no place to rest. And in fact, the rest truly, it's interesting, it's because they left the promised land. They're out of the promised land, you guys. There's no rest in this component. The problem is they couldn't find it. They couldn't find rest. In fact, in verse 4, it says this, the roads to Zion mourn, for no one comes to the appointed festival. So think about this. They're not in the land anymore. There's no rest. And let's just imagine that there were people sitting next to the road. They're waiting for people to come to the festivals. Remember the 3 famous festivals? You got the Passover, you got Pentecost, you got the Tabernacles. Nobody's even coming to these things. All of her gates deserted. Her priests are groaning, whether the priests are actually in Judah and they're fleeing to Egypt, or maybe they're actually in exile, hoping to get back. But either way, they're mourning because nothing's happening anymore. Like the great and glorious holy city of Jerusalem, of Zion, nobody's flowing in and out. Nobody's flowing in and out of the city. Verse 5 says this, her adversaries have become her masters. Her enemies are at ease, for the Lord has made her suffer. Because of her many transgressions, her children have gone away as captives before the adversary. I think this is probably one of the saddest pictures, actually, in verse 5. And you could say, well, how so? It says her children have gone away. There's no sign of potential growth. The kids are gone. They're gone. There's no sign of is there ever going to be any growth into this land? Is there ever going to be any hope where it looks completely dark? Verse 6, and remember, this is just Jeremiah. All he's doing, you guys, he's lamenting, he's distressed, he's literally having loud cries saying, God, how have we gotten to this point? And in verse 6, all her splendor has vanished from daughter Zion. Her leaders are like stags. They find no pasture. They walk away exhausted before the hunter. And Scripture continues in verse 7. During the days of her affliction and homelessness, Jerusalem remembers all her precious belongings that were heirs, all her precious belongings that were heirs in hers in days of old. When her people fell into the adversary's hand, she had no one to help. The adversaries looked at her, laughing over her downfall. And Jerusalem, here's the reality. Jerusalem has sinned grievously. Therefore, she's become an object of scorn. She becomes, you guys, the laughing stock of the nations. All who honored her now despise her. And then look at this next verse. It's really graphic, but it says, for they have seen her nakedness. She herself groans and turns away. What does that mean? It means that the wretched state of her sinfulness is all exposed to everybody. That's where that nakedness picture of no clothes, just this is who I am. And it's not pretty. And builds on this and builds on this. In fact, Tom Constable says Jerusalem has embarrassed herself. And then it says in verse 9, her uncleanness, if you go to verse 9 for me, her uncleanness stains her skirts. She never considered her end. You know what that means? It means she never really thought about all of the sin that she was doing. She never thought about the consequences. You think about this. Her uncleanness stains her skirts, and then she never considered her end. Isn't that the truth, you guys, when you're walking in rebellion, when you're walking in sin? You never really think about, how does this actually impact somebody else? That's why, to me, it's one of the saddest things when families split up. It breaks my heart, actually, families that have kids and parents divorce. Look, I'm not here to judge on reasonings. It's not for me to say. I'll just tell you, though, whatever that reason is, whatever happens, the kids have to go through all kinds of junk. I'll never forget interviewing Jackie Velasquez when we had a radio program earlier on in the days of Time to Revive, and she was doing a study. In fact, she was ministering to people, but she always said it takes 7 years, to recover mentally from their parents getting a divorce. That's not meant to make anybody feel bad, but I want us to think through the consequences when you go through these things. In this text right here, I didn't even think about my end. I didn't even think about how this actually impacts somebody else. And isn't that the truth how Satan works? He doesn't care about, he just wants you to fall. And her downfall was astonishing. Look, and in the process, there's nobody there to comfort her. In verse 9, it says, nobody is there to comfort her. Nobody's there, even though the stains on her skirt, even though she didn't even think about the end, she's exposed herself naked, nobody is there to help. Look on my affliction, for the enemy triumphs. And that's exactly where Satan wants all of us. Satan is here to steal, kill, and destroy. And guess what? He did a great job through his people, through God's people in Jerusalem. And Jeremiah is just looking at this whole scenario like, what has happened? And in fact, it gets so bad, you guys. Let me say this in verse 10. The adversary has seized all of her precious belongings. She has even seen the nations enter her sanctuary. You know what that means? Kevin, what does that mean? What nations are walking into where?
All the nations have walked into the temple.
Yep. And then it says in verse 11, it's talking about, they don't even have food, you guys. All her people in Jerusalem, they groan while they search for bread. They've traded their precious belongings for food in order to stay alive. Look and see how I have become despised. Jeremiah is just sorrowful over the city of Jerusalem because of sin. But now you got to flip it. Now you got to flip it in verses 12 and on, 12 through 22. Now what we would consider this would be, and most would agree, here you have Jerusalem's sorrow. So now you're going to have a corporate perspective, okay? A different way of looking at it. It's an insider's perspective from Jerusalem looking out, okay? Does that make sense? And so this is what you're seeing here. It said, is this nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look and see, is there any pain like mine which was dealt out to me, which the Lord made me suffer on the day of his burning anger? He sent fire. Look at this image. You're going to see God's judgment poured out through different images, okay? So one of the images is you're going to see fire, okay? Another one that we'll get into is a net. Look at this. It says, he sent fire from heaven into my bones. He made it descend. And then he said, it spread like a net for my feet and turned me back. He made me desolate, sick all day long. Can I just tell you, when there is sorrow and when you're dealing with this stuff, you get sick sometimes. I'm not saying because you're sick, it's because of sin. I'm just saying, but this is one that you can go to. He made me desolate, sick all day long because, man, what in the world is going on? Anybody ever been to that point? You're so sick to your stomach about a situation? In verse 14, the scripture continues on. He says, my transgressions have formed me into a yoke. Fastened together by his hand, they've been placed on my neck. And the Lord has broken my strength. He handed me over to those I cannot withstand. And so, again, another form of judgment. Fire, a net, and yoke. It's so heavy, I can't. What in the world? You brought me under bondage to the Babylonians? He says in verse 15, the Lord has rejected all the mighty men within me. He summoned an army against me to crush my young warriors. The Lord has trampled virgin daughter Judah like grapes in a winepress. And so again, you just see different images, you guys, of the judgment and how it's expressed. Fire, net, a yoke, a weight. Warriors are coming against me. And then look in verse 16. He says, I weep because of these things. My eyes flow with tears. There's no one nearby to comfort me, no one to keep me alive. My children are desolate because the enemy has prevailed. Zion stretches out her hands. There's nobody to comfort her. The Lord has issued a decree against Jacob that his neighbors should be his adversaries. And Jerusalem has become something impure among them. Very rarely do you ever hear that language. Jerusalem, you guys, is listed as impure. Verse 18, the Lord is just though. For I have rebelled. Look at this. You hear this confession? I have rebelled against his command. Listen, all you people, look at my pain. My young men and women have gone into captivity. You want to know why the Israelites, you want to know why Jewish people need to read this every year? You want to know why we need to understand this? Because look what happens when we rebel against him. We cannot forget about Lamentations. A time of lamenting sometimes actually comes from our wretched sin. And I don't want you to forget the pain as I look at Jerusalem falling apart. My temple is completely destroyed. Please, we've even lost our kids. Verse 19, it says, I've called to my lovers, but they've betrayed me. I got nobody. My priests, the elders, they perished in the city while searching for food to keep themselves alive. Verse 20, look, see how I'm in distress. I am churning within. You know what that means? I am not settled. I'm not restful. Why? Because I'm in exile, or I'm looking at the situation like I'm not where I'm supposed to be. My heart is broken, for I have been very rebellious. I will tell you, in a period of lamentations, you guys, in a period of crying out to the Lord, you have to get to this point where your heart is broken and you realize you are rebellious. That you realize that I realize I am walking in sin. We need to realize that. Outside the sword takes the children. Inside there is death. And finally, as we wrap up in 21 and 22, people have heard me groaning, but there is no one to comfort me. All my enemies have heard of my misfortune. They are glad, actually, that you have caused this, God. Bring on the day you've announced so that they may become like me. And finally, in verse 22, let all their wickedness come before you and deal with them as you have dealt with me because of all of my transgressions. For my groans are many and I am sick at heart. This is real. This is a very real situation for somebody looking at a situation. Family's gone, city is gone, and they're turning to the Lord. And here's the deal. When you get to Lamentations 3:22 through 24, you're going to realize the only way you can get to this point. The only way is, one, you have to recognize the sinfulness. And two, guess what? God says you can still come to me. When you realize that I am your portion, He'll carry us through this. All right, guys, this is the book of Lamentations 1 and 2, and we will cover just one chapter tomorrow on the book of Lamentations, chapter 3. Thanks.